at first it was mainly for me just surviving it, like some kind of physical ailment, like a paralysis had set in. I was to a degree paralyzed by the power of what was happening inside me. And I came to recognize that if I just shut up and let it happen, I would learn from it.
I look at Kundalini as the life force, and that, and I've always looked at it, used kind of the yogic model, which basically has developed practices for activating Kundalini, moving it up through the body, and bringing about what I've come to see as a clearing process, as well as a transformative process. So for some people, especially if it's happens suddenly and without any understanding of what's going on, it can be very dramatic and difficult. And other people, for example, if they've been practicing yoga for a long time and they have an understanding or a deep meditation practice, it can be more gradual. For me, it wasn't painful and challenging in the sense that you experienced, but it was remarkably shifting. It happened for me after doing some energy work, and I was sitting in a classroom on the floor, and all of a sudden my body just started rippling up over and over and over again, and it put me actually into a very ecstatic state, and I kind of stayed in that kind of an opening and expansiveness for several weeks. But that, for me, it came after years of spiritual practice, meditation practice, energy opening, psychotherapy. So I had kind of an understanding. So it didn't alarm me. I never had fear arise in the process. But I know for you, you had some physical injuries going on prior to this event. And that was probably one of the factors for why it was so terribly difficult for you.
Yes, I certainly did have, well, these were not really injuries that were palpable and apparent. They were more something that happened to me as a child, in terms of, I had this splinter incident that I talk about in my book, Deciphering the Golden Flower, One Secret at a Time, where I failed to have that. I was 7 years old and I failed to have it treated. Specifically, I mean, deliberately, I ignored it. And it caused, I think it was in my heel, which is a kind of nerve nexus. And it started me imploding physically. And and the outward signs were I lost certain talents that I had. I was, at 7 years old, I was a very good tennis player, a very good singer, and I was very good at math. And when I was out of school for almost 6 months before the splinter worked its way out, and the doctor saw it, and because they don't show up in x-rays, wood does not show up in an x-ray. And then he took it out. And by that time, when I went back to school, a competitive school, I discovered that I'd lost all these talents. When we first had a singing thing in the choir, I couldn't sing.
Wow.
And, I came back from school and told my mother, I forgot how to do math. And he was like, what do you mean you forgot? You've been away from school for 6 months. Of course you've fallen behind. You haven't forgotten how to do math. But I had this natural facility of being able to, move numbers around in my head, even at a young age. And when I came back, everything was really difficult. I had to do it by rote. I had to remember and memorize everything. But
did it seem like your whole nervous system was damaged by this experience?
It was definitely neurologically related, because the splinter went in and evidently hit a nerve nexus, and I started to implode or to shrivel. And one side of my body, if you take like a figure 8, one side started to it was like opposites. So I was like a crooked 8, where one side and then the other side. So these two sides these two sides were out of sync, and one part, the back of this shoulder was imploding, and this front, and these two were growing abnormally larger. But then, you know, like in the laws of neuroplasticity, something that happens in the brain, damage to the brain can affect a limb. Conversely, damage to a limb can affect the brain, because they communicate through nerve channels. So that's what happened. And I you know, everybody said, oh no, you know, you just, it'll all come back. There's, you know, it's all in your head. You're imagining it. But so I really started off, I changed not only my psychic capabilities and mental capabilities, it forced me to redefine myself outwardly, my persona. And I had been more like a mesomorph, very physical, and I became this ectomorph, which is more of a cerebral person. But so I was denied my true identity, and I kind of knew it, but didn't know what would happen, because I went along with what everybody was telling me, because I was only 7 years old, and they knew more than I did. So, but somehow subliminally, I didn't. But also I developed in a very negative way, because I had lost these capabilities, and I started to, as I grew older, I started drinking and using drugs and everything like that. And Kundalini, when it hit, it immediately went to my ankle and started working, sending signals, and then starting pulling my brain and using these elixirs to kind of fertilize parts of the brain and send this extra energy. At one point during this awakening process, I felt my solar plexus open up and a force field of energy shoot out in an arc trajectory to my brain, and the third eye opened to receive this. Like it was like a castanet. It opened, and then it started spraying this elixir on parts of the brain, which then had a direct link to parts of the body that and it started this work of pulling my shoulders back into correct proportions. But out of all of this, I get to the point where I know that this physical work took place, but throughout the process, you can't let it stand at that. But I am still just as bewildered by terminology like spiritual awakening as I was at the beginning. I mean, after all, what is a spiritual awakening? To me, it was kind of it just this fertile ground that it wasn't something that was going to come to me suddenly, but it was something where I saw my habits changing. I saw me wanting to take on better, more spiritually aligned habits. Is that?
Yeah, well, let me respond a little bit. I'd like to comment a little bit too on your experience, because as you know, I've worked with several thousand people over the years, so I've listened to a lot of interesting experiences and a huge range of how people both open to this energy and deal with it after it's awakened. And in some cases, there are dramatic healings and shifts. In others, old injuries seem to come to the forefront. It's almost like it stirs up latent illnesses and things that need to be faced and dealt with. But I see Kundalini not necessarily as required initially for an awakening, because I've seen many people who've had, and I'll define awakening in a minute, who have had a shift, a dramatic shift of consciousness or self-realization before the energy awakens. But when it happens that way, eventually there usually is some kind of an energetic component. My sense of Kundalini is that it's your life force. It's carrying consciousness. It moves through the body in ways that both clear out old patterns and transform the heart energy, transform the throat energy, transform the brain, so that there's dramatic shifts in how we're identified. For me, a spiritual awakening is a shift of identification out of our old created, conditioned self into a sense that we are an energy or a consciousness that is universally connected, that there's one consciousness that's moving through all of us. We have a glimpse of that, or a touch of that, or even a shift into feeling we are that for some period of time. And an initial awakening of initial spiritual awakening is that shift, where an initial Kundalini awakening is this activation of energy. And then I feel like after an initial experience, there's usually a very long period where people feel like at times they are caught in their old patterns again, but maybe some of the old conditioning has fallen away. So some of your old habits may fall away. I've seen people who suddenly can't eat meat anymore, or they can't hold an argument or a position they used to have because they see everything in a new way. So there's a kind of a I've got it, I've lost it syndrome that most people go through, where they feel moments when they're very expansive and connected, and there might even be bliss arising, and they feel moments when they're feeling depressed or entangled in some old belief system or reactivity that upsets them, that to find themselves, oh my gosh, I thought I really had it, and now I'm back in this complicated, difficult space. And this goes on for years in most cases, but my sense is that as the process matures, that there's more and more of a timeline in which you feel very free and content and open, and less of the reactivity and entanglement that our minds get into. And at the same time, usually the first year or so is the most dramatic with Kundalini energy, the most intense. And especially if a person is using any kind of substances or alcohol, or doing a lot of dramatic practices, it will be more intense. Or if you're in a very stressful life situation, the energy will get more intense. One person that's written about it has called it it's a stress reducer, that it doesn't want stress in your body. It wants you to become very open, almost equanimous, where you're not having the contractions and the conflicts, either the physical contractions or the inner psychological division that most of us carry throughout our lives. So this is a clearing of all of that personal stuff, and it's a healing of traumatic stuff that's locked in the body. It's an opening up and releasing that. One of the reasons it's so challenging is because a lot of stuff that's been suppressed arises up, because you have to see it before it can be released. And so you have a lot of phenomena that happens just because of your history. So people's personal history, whether it be physiological issues or psychological, things like abuse or having been in a very traumatic situation like a war, the feelings that were all kind of suppressed and contracted arise to be faced. And many people also feel like things are coming up from previous lives. It's almost universal issues will come up. I have a sense that the clearing is not even just personal, that somehow we're clearing our lineage, we're clearing our family history. So if there's been a whole line of abuse, or you come from a background where your family was caught up in Germany during the war, that all of that, sometimes emotions that you don't even have the memory of what they're about, come up right in your face. And it's partly because it's a process that's trying to free you of everything that keeps you from feeling free and open to life as it is. And that's how I see a spiritual awakening. I don't see it as religious. I see it as the spirit becoming free of the conditioning, and that changes dramatically your perspective on life. And that's why you can't carry on in some of your old habits anymore. If you do, you suffer a lot more for it. So that's kind of my macro
macro summary. It happened to me in a kind of a micro fashion where I was, one thing would happen and I had to kind of integrate that or feel that it was that I was going in a new direction. And so I would have to release something, some known or pattern behavior that was deleterious to my being. And this happened in many different aspects of life: psychic, somatic, metabolic, psychological, mental, physical. And for me, the first year, I was unable to do any, I was unable to hold any kind of job. And it wasn't that I didn't think about it. I knew that it was necessary, that I have to get back sometime to work. I was frequently, I had to lay down 2 times a day, absolutely, just, or my strength would deplete. I had to make sure that I had enough food. And Gopi Krishna mentions that too, where I think he has this very well-phrased sentence about tongues of flame searching his belly for food when he needed replenishment, because the energy, that's one of the sources, is the pranic sources is. And so from that, I was made very aware of pure food and drink. The need or the desire for drugs and alcohol fell away of their own accord.
Right.
And during that time, I read a lot and I tried to figure it out and piece it together. At first, because this happened in 1972, I had practiced the Secret of the Golden Flower meditation method and kind of deciphered that just by orneriness and just by sticking to it. And I had no idea. I knew something should happen because the book kept talking about these crazy things that were going to happen, but in very poetic language. And I had never heard the word Kundalini. It's not mentioned once in the book. But gradually, I came out of that and went back to work. I was living in France at the time, so it was a very benign lifestyle because it was. I had a lot of opportunities of teaching and different things like that, but I couldn't take large quantities of noise or light or even sunlight. It just had an electrifying effect. And I had a client in my negotiation class who worked for Renault, the car maker, and he invited me to overlook the factory and to take a tour of the factory. And I did, and it was this immense thing with like all these different things happening. I had to leave after about 10 minutes because of the electromagnetic energy I could just feel it coursing through me. Detrimentally, deleteriously, it was having a very negative effect. And
I'd like to just comment on that for a second, because it's such a common issue that it's almost as if every sense in your body becomes more enhanced. And so you're much more sensitive in the world. And many of the people I talk to can't even go into big box stores, let alone car factories. They have to make radical changes in their lifestyle. They can't hang out with the people they used to if there's any toxicity or if their work is toxic for them in any way. And sounds, they can be very super sensitive to sound and any other kind of sensation. I think that the nerves just get, you can think about yourself having gone from 110 to 220 wiring, and if there's a lot of energy running, you can also become very energetically depleted. So you're describing things that I've heard many, many times, that people sometimes are exhausted. They may have run from having huge amounts of energy to all of a sudden total exhaustion for a while. And often the hormonal system gets out of whack because of this, and they end up with thyroid or adrenal issues. So it's a huge shift, not only in your consciousness, but in your physiology. And you really have to honor that and make adjustments for it to work more smoothly. So I just wanted to comment before you moved on, because I know that your experiences are going to be relevant to so many people.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly the way it was. And I'm glad I haven't talked to that. I've talked to a lot of people, but I haven't run across people who, they talk about energy depletion, but not that kind of thing where just a big box will stir you up negatively. And on the other side, there are places or events or situations you go into where you feel a positive energy and you feel energized by this. And so the whole thing of spiritual awakening, to me, it's kind of anecdotal and eclectic. That I'm not sure that there's a one moment of complete total understanding, at least for me. I know I've seen accounts of that, and it must happen. But to me, and I think probably because the Kundalini had so much work to do on my body, that that it was really a question of first things first. I mean, you don't want to start when you're, and I think you need to have that physical, like quote unquote perfection, if you're going to get to that next step spiritually, those next steps of more spiritual awake or total consciousness. I feel there's a kind of a consciousness meter that has followed my physical rebuilding, that the more conscious, the more my physical rebuilding progressed, the more conscious and aware I became of how to look at, if I was a being of pure spirit, nothing would matter, because there wouldn't be any war, negative emotion. But inhabiting bodies as we do, they are a drag on our spiritual development because of the materialistic desires and things that we think we have to, and the ego, because the ego is so attached to the body, our body image and everything like that. And I really had to overcome that. And it was difficult, because once it did happen, it showed me, I then kind of learned about my whole, everything related to the accident. And I thought, oh, that's what happened. Oh yeah, the accident really did affect my being. It affected my physiology. It affected, and which in turn affected my psychology, and my image in high school became a much more difficult persona to deal with. I had to deal with a kind of, because instead of Othello, I was like kind of a Iago type, not out of meanness, but just as I was no longer the principal person that I was. I was kind of an ancillary person in relationships. And I felt that this wasn't really me, but I couldn't, for the life of me, imagine how I would get back to that being that I knew I was destined to be. So, and why did it happen to me, Kundalini? I think that that a lot of times the mesomorph types are so sure of themselves in their physical beings that they don't pursue the spiritual. They may give lip service to going to church and things like that, but it's more, it seems to me that a lot of the people that I know who have been visited by Kundalini, either deliberately or accidentally, are people who have some sort of rebuilding or jiggering to do.
Well, let me comment on that because I want to give you a little different perspective of a few of the things you said. It may be that you're attracting those people because your writing is about this dramatic changes that went on in you physiologically. What I find is that many of the people who call me have been in spiritual practices for many years, and they're in systems where they really didn't get the support they needed in their spiritual community. They were very serious meditators, and when energy started moving, the teacher they had couldn't cope with that, especially if there was psychological phenomena coming up. So I think that it's very common for people who are very more devoted in their whole life to wanting to know truth or wanting to know God to have these kind of awakenings too. And also, I would never use the word perfection for the body or anything else that's required in this process, because I think that many people will have an awakening of Kundalini in the midst of a terrible accident or injury or surgery. And also, there's a lot of evidence that people who are dying, that there's a period of time where there's a real opportunity for consciousness to remember itself and wake up. And so the yogis say that Kundalini comes into the body when we're conceived, and it's our energy force, and it creates the baby, and the residual energy coils at the base of the spine, and then it holds us in stasis energetically throughout our life, unless either a practice or an injury or maybe using psychedelics can do this. Various many other things, a shock, a terrible emotional shock or physical shock can open it. And I think it just, if it happens to you, it's because your number is up. It was meant to be in this lifetime. You stumbled into the method, or the method grabbed you, and therefore you're stuck with it, whether or not your body is in good shape. But the worse problems your body has, the more difficult the process is going to be, because it's trying to heal. It's just like surgery is pretty painful. And if you did it without an anesthetic, it wouldn't feel good. And also, if your diet's been off, or you have a lot of toxins in your body from alcohol or drug use or stress, it's trying to release it. So you're going to have more difficulty than if you've had a more manageable lifestyle that's a little more healthy. So there is a movement toward better health, but you don't have to have a perfect body for this to activate. And in many cases, I think there's a book I often recommend to people called The Grace of Dying, by a woman that's a Buddhist and a hospice worker and a psychologist. And she's talks about many cases where people seem to have that opportunity to have complete awakening of consciousness in their dying process, which is to me a support for that yogic perspective that and it's true. If you've ever been with somebody that's dying, you can see the energy leaves the body. You can almost watch it happening, and some people can feel it happening. Our energy and our consciousness expands and falls into the ethers. And in our peak experiences with Kundalini or consciousness awakening, that's a similar kind of experience, only you don't die. The body doesn't give up. It's more like the spirit experiences that I am this, and then comes back in, or you become more reoriented into your physical form. And yeah, then you might have some real repair work to do, because the tendency is for this life force to want our body to be vibrant and harmonious inside, so that it can create profound healing shifts. But it can take a few years. It can be very difficult and exhausting for some people. But I also want to point out, for most people, it isn't all that bad. You could say there's a scale where it feels like hell for a while versus you're mostly in bliss, or you feel a lot of vibration in your body, and you relax into it, and you can feel the movement or see the movement, and it doesn't feel bad at all. For the most part, Kundalini is not painful. And I bring this up because there's a lot of mythology around how dangerous it is. And I feel like one of the most difficult things people experience is fear. And if you're afraid and you're contracted around it, it's going to feel a lot more uncomfortable. So I think we really need to break this mythology about it being dangerous, because it happens to people who really are seeking to know what's true, are seeking to be loved, are seeking to heal suffering. And if that in the midst of that opportunity, you're suddenly contracted with fear, you only slow down the process. And the process really leads to an extreme inner peace and a sense of an open heart if you let it move through the heart area, and a sense of appreciating the great beauty of form. You recognize the power of this formless consciousness, but you also, if you're really going to wake up deeply, come back into the body and recognize the miracle of being in a human body and having this amazing planet. So it's transformative on all levels of life if you let it continue through its natural fruition. That's been my observation with people that have had this experience.
Perfection. When I talk about perfection, what I'm really alluding to is that at that time, when it first happened to me, I was able to see inside my brain, and at the same time, I was able to see an overlay, a kind of template around my body, which I realized was my perfect body, like the causal body that was formed, or created probably before the moment of conception, because that body, or that blueprint, and I think I can prove that it exists, and it's been talked about by other people. It's called sometimes the field, or that there's, before the union, the physical union of mother and father, there is this conceptual body that could be like a model of the causal body, or a blueprint. And since my body was torn apart by this accident, and then started to be refurbished or re-engineered after Kundalini, what my question was, well, where was this information stored for this work? I mean, how did Kundalini know that it needed to, that it was, that there were these irregularities of my body, and start to work on them immediately? So that's when I talk about, I don't think we attain perfection in the body, but that perfect body, I could see it, and I could feel it overlaying me, and I could feel the parts that were distorted being pulled in the direction of that overlay so that it would become perfect. And once again, but obviously a lot of things that we do interfere with that perfection during life. I mean, we have an accident or something like that, or we take prescription opioids, and that obviously affects just every part of us. And as far as the danger of Kundalini, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's always something that drives like, let's say, I'll say I'm a proponent too, that it's a kind of a dart you can throw at proponents, say, well, you know, it's dangerous, but there's no getting around it. If there's any getting around it, it may be in the strip mall mentality today of people going off, you know, Kundalini becoming this strip mall fad, to be replaced at some time in the future by another fad. and people going about it in the wrong way. Or is it the wrong way? We don't know. I mean, it's evolution and it's destiny. But
Yeah.
sometimes I feel that there's a miss that well, I feel like you that it happened because it was meant to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that for me, and I feel for many others. But then a lot of people who are struggling, and you may have. Well, I don't know if you encountered that, because you say a lot of the people that come to you talk about that they were working on along lines of very reputable, let's say, spiritual practices, and somehow they got to a point where they just couldn't go any further with the teacher that they had. But I had no teacher, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's, to me, I encourage people not to look for a teacher,
Hmm.
because in the final analysis, you have to be your own best spiritual detective, and you have to be honest with yourself. And doing it alone, the solitary path teaches you this.
I
And
agree.
I think I learned more from this than I did from anybody I've ever talked to. And I
Sure.
remember Gopi Krishna telling me that after Kundalini, he looked throughout India for somebody to back up or to verify his experience. And he said he got more uh, feedback from the rickshaw drivers and just people that he'd meet on the street or in a restaurant than he did from any so-called gurus or spiritual uh, mukti mucks.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a lot of things I want to comment on. I like your way of looking at perfection, because what you're really saying is that um, it's the perfect way you were meant to be. It's
Yes,
your own unique, um,
yes,
the unique stamp of you in the world. And I do agree with that, that I think Kundalini is trying to bring us into our most, um, our own, each of us, our own unique way of being fully present in the world and fully useful to the world. And it's unique for each of us. There's not one standard of what is perfect, but at some level also everything is perfect just the way it is. And so I like the way that you encountered that understanding of perfection and the vision that you had. Many people who call me have had been awakened through some kind of an intense practice they found on the internet, or through some kind of a overload of doing so many Westerners, we overload ourselves. You might be doing qigong one day and yoga one day, and going into altered states, and then having some marijuana on the weekend. You're overloading the body and the mind with all of these stimulus, and there can be an explosive awakening from all of that overload. So I talk to people like that too. A number of young people who have had activations with ayahuasca, things like that. And often the biggest problem is there's no framework, there's no understanding of what is going on. So you might spend a great deal of time thinking you're either dying or going crazy. And often the people around you will say the same thing, even your doctor, because so few people have an understanding of this process. So people get into much more difficulties and delays when they have these sudden radical openings. I think the value of a teacher isn't so much, you cannot give up your autonomy. You really have to keep your own you've got to develop your own intuitive sense with your gut feeling about what's right for you and follow that. But I do think that certain teachers can model or give you a framework for awakening that gives you, you could say, a sense of direction or a sense of purpose in why this is happening to you. So I think that it's fine to draw from teachers, various teachers, not so much with advice, especially if intuitively the advice feels off, but for inspiration. If you can get inspiration from good teachers, from people that are already have gone through this process. Um, I do think that most guru types are stuck in whatever their particular methodology or system, especially if they have a particular lineage. And they're not very open to people who come in with experiences that haven't been evolving through their particular lineage. They want you to, they feel like they can work with you if you've been their student all along, and this is what you're doing, what's happening to you is what they expect. And they can say, okay, now you probably need to do this or try this. But they don't want to take somebody from the outside that's had a sudden awakening and give them advice. And that's unfortunate, because if there may be some teachers out there who really can do have a sense of the energetic transformation that's going on, but they don't really want an interest in you unless you're committed to them. And that doesn't work for most people who've already had an awakening. It's, as you say, a very personal, interior connection that you have to make with your gut level sense of, what do I need to do in this moment? What do I need to, how do I lean into this experience? How do I cope with this? But it's much easier for people who've had some background in either psychology, so they've learned to witness themselves a little bit more, or spiritual practice, which can also bring you into a deeper place of witnessing, so that you have a bigger container. It's much more difficult when people are young the way you were, and they come into it through drug use or some intense practice like you were doing, that doesn't have a guide of any kind that can tell you, I know you're expecting this, and this is okay, this is healing you, or this is what you can do to support your process. That would be wonderful if more people did have that, but unfortunately, the people that contact you and I don't have that. Maybe there's a lot of people who have it, but they're not the ones that are calling us, because they're already okay with what's going on in their process.
Yeah, I guess I've never found a teacher because I was, I think I talk a lot about Kundalini as the ultimate experience in the laboratory of your own body.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I'm a living experiment, like we
Yeah.
all are. I mean, if we go to McDonald's, as the guy proved in his movie, and eat McDonald's foods for long enough, we will, it's an experiment.
Yeah.
So I didn't find a teacher, and then I came to realize that after speaking to gurus, I met Muktananda in Paris, and on the day he was going to take off to go to Oakland to set up his thing, and I drove out into the suburbs of Paris and witnessed his final thing, and basically there were just a lot of sycophants. The whole thing was, who's going to get to ride in the car with Muktananda to the airport?
Yeah.
And the ones that were going to be left behind, they were like all drooping and whining, and I saw that that was almost the same thing as trying to find a doctor. That trying to find a guru for me was the same thing as if I'd gone to a doctor and explained to them, well, I've got this thing happening inside of me. I don't know what it is, but maybe you know, and you know now. And I knew, because I never went to a doctor, I knew that that's what I would get, that kind of reaction.
Yeah.
I built a flow chart that just like a regular data processing flow chart of the various steps leading to Kundalini, like the inklings, and then the detective work where you try to find something and find a teacher or find a book or find a recording or something like that. And little by little, you get there until, and all that first part is you do it. You're looking for it. And then when Kundalini hits, it starts doing you.
Absolutely.
Sit back and relax, Not that it's going to take care of anything, but it's going to start presenting you with these features and these abilities for spiritual awakening. It's going to give you this whole new perspective, as you so carefully drew out a moment ago, of like how you will be affected. And I saw that so clearly. Like I had done all these things to get where I started to meditate. And then all of a sudden, I didn't need to do anything like that. I didn't need to go. I tried to find some kind of support for being able to terminology, like what is this? But I knew that it would provide me with any of the answers that any questions, whether expressed overtly or just questions inside my mind. Kundalini was capable of answering these questions.
I think that's true. I think most of our questions, if we really sit with the question, the answer is already inside of us, but it takes some time and patience sometimes for the right movement or option or whatever it is to arise within us. I think that many people go through this process at a point where the awakening arises, that there's a value in meditating still, because to me it's like going to the source, going to the core of what we are, going to the essence, and marinating in that, just kind of allowing that open spaciousness to bring up the answers to our questions, or to invite consciousness to a bigger picture of what we are, and that we can, over time, by continuing to sit, develop much more of a direct connection with source. And to me, the answers are coming from source. The healing is coming from source. The enlightenment, should it happen, is coming from source. And I agree with you, it's a physiological process as well. It's not just a transcendent process. I believe that meditation is actually biochemically changing the brain. It's changing the balance in the brain. It's changing our chemical dynamics. And that's why when people meditate a great deal, they can become more at peace in themselves, more present in the world, more harmonious. So sometimes people in the process will feel like the meditation is creating too much energy. Ways to deal with that: one is to kind of keep your eyes open, or learn or meditate in a way, go into that still, below the neck kind of presence, beingness, while you're going for a walk in nature. So meditation is not necessarily like disappearing from the world. It's more of a coming into a quieter place in yourself and letting that flower, that is the golden flower. It's that deep still point within us that allows us to transform emotionally, psychologically, physically, and psychically. We don't have any control over it. We can't predict what will happen. Everybody's unique, so you never know what will arise for whom. For example, you've talked a bit about some of your psychic openings. For a lot of people, there isn't a lot of psychic phenomena, but there may be a great deal of love and harmony in the heart opening, more deep peace. For other people, there's dramatic psychic realizations or connectedness. It's a very unpredictable process. You kind of have to be willing to live in the unknown and to embrace that. What's going to happen today? What's the next rising that I have to face and understand better? Or maybe you won't really understand it, but you can learn to live with that or as that, and let the process open up for you. Our time is moving ahead here for our first session together. And I just want to mention, in case anybody is tuned in to learn more about this process, the two books I have on Amazon, The Awakening Guide and the Kundalini Guide. So the Kundalini Guide talks about a lot of the energetic changes and how to cope with them. And the Awakening Guide focuses much more on what happens to people after a shift of consciousness, that kind of an awakening, and how it affects the way we function in the world and the things that keep coming up. Because I don't think that awakening, or certainly enlightenment, it's not a one-time shot. It's a long lifetime evolution. And I think it's much as much a physiological evolution of the human as it is a spiritual process.
Meditation is an experiment in the laboratory of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you said, it seems like it's the less is more answer to aerobics. Instead of that frantic energy, the secret of the golden flower is telling you less is more. Stillness is where it's at. Slow your metabolism down, and you will start to notice energy buildups in the lower body, and then you will be able to draw that energy up the spine into the brain by using what they term as the backward flowing method. And I have a book called The Backward Flowing Method, The Secret of Life and Death. Well, can you believe it? All wrapped into one. But to me, there is no death. That's one of the secrets, that it's just another condition, another state of being. And I have, I realized when Kundalini struck or rose, I realized two things immediately that just came to me whole cloth. One was all violence is self-hate. And the second one was that there was no death. That if my solar plexus could open up and send energy outside my body into my brain, then I was connected to just about everything. And that's living proof of that connection.
Yeah. I think that's fabulous, wonderful. Those are probably two of the most valuable insights anyone could ever experience. I think that the fear of death underlies so much of the trauma in our lives and our world, and that to get clear of that is to understand that you're not limited to this body. It's like a vehicle. You're using it for a while so that you can have these kinds of connections like you and I are having right now. And I think it's wonderful. Yeah.
Not just from people like us, but from every incident.
Everyone.
Krishna learning from the rickshaw driver.
And the animals, the wonderful animals around in our life, and the birds and the trees. It's like we get to have a human experience because we have these vehicles, which we need to do what we can to take care of them. And but to be free of the sense that that's your limitation, and to recognize you're more than that, that there's something that's going to extend and expand way beyond this form, is a great blessing.
To mindfully recognize that the ego is doing what it's doing, and it's not going to stop. If we didn't inhabit bodies, there would be no ego, but we do, and so we have to deal with it. And most people are captives of the ego, and I felt unfettered when Kundalini rose, and all of a sudden, whoa.
Yeah.
Did I bargain for this? But and I think you have to be a kind of personality that doesn't mind being a laboratory, a walking, breathing, living laboratory experiment.
Yeah. To have a little adventure in you.
ce mystère éternel. C'est comme un jeu entre deux, mon cher ami. Personne ne sait vraiment pourquoi l'amour soit là. Un soir, un sentiment, un regard. Ce n'est qu'un rire qui peut changer tout dans la vie. Paris, c'est l'amour, un mystère éternel. Et un jeu entre deux, c'est l'amour.